Okay, so we're really taking a deep dive this time, huh? Residential childcare worker. It's more than just a job for you, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah, way more.
You sent me so much stuff from RoleCatcher, it's impressive. Their career guide, their interview advice, they even had a whole section on using AI for the job search. Wild.
It's incredible how much the field is changing.
I know, right? Like, we're not messing around here. But okay, before we even get to that, let's give everyone a little snapshot of what a residential childcare worker actually does. The RoleCatcher guide really lays it out there. Direct care, guidance, working with kids who have physical or mental disabilities. It's all about making their environment positive.
Right. And it's not just about one specific thing either. They emphasize specialization a lot.
Yeah, finding your niche. And speaking of, they get into the job market too, and wow, it can be intense.
That's one thing they don't sugarcoat, how emotionally demanding this kind of work can be.
Yeah, and you can tell just from reading it. It's about resilience, patience. Like, you have to be a special kind of person, you know?
You really do. You're working with kids who have been through so much, often trauma, neglect. The guide had this whole story about a worker named Sarah.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
She helped this young boy, they called him Alex in the book, who hadn't spoken in years because of past trauma. And because Sarah knew about trauma-informed care, she was able to make this space for him that was safe. And one day, he just looked right at her and said her name. It was like this huge victory.
Oh, wow. I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
It's those little wins that mean everything in this field.
Yeah, and it's not all heavy stuff. They make sure to talk about the positive side too. You know, the personal growth, the connections you build with the kids and their families. But I gotta say, I was floored when they got to the interview section. They had a whole list of questions you might get asked.
That's so smart. I wish every career guide did that.
Right. And get this, they even suggest using AI to help you prep your answers. What is this? The future.
It's crazy how tech is everywhere now, even in these really human-centered jobs.
It's mind-blowing. So
Yeah.
basically, we're looking at a career that's insanely fulfilling, but also requires a ton emotionally and, like, as a person in general, you know?
Absolutely. It's not about being some superhero. It's about genuine empathy, being there for those kids, putting their needs first. It really is like a calling, you know? Like they said in the guide.
They did. They totally did.
Like a calling. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It makes me think about all the stuff in the guide about how society is changing, how that impacts this work.
Oh, totally. So, like, what are we talking about here? What kind of changes?
Well, a big one is this move toward having care happen more in the community. Like, instead of those big institutions, we're trying to support kids right in their communities, ideally with their families whenever possible.
Okay, yeah, I've heard about that. Sounds great. But I bet that means residential childcare workers have to be way more adaptable than they used to, right?
100%. It's not just about working in one type of facility anymore. They had all these examples in the guide group homes, going into families' actual homes to help out, even stuff like respite care so families can get a break. You need a way wider range of skills now.
And I bet that whole specialization thing comes into play even more, right? Like, you need to be an expert in something specific.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. You could be with a child who has autism one day, then the next day you're supporting someone with Down syndrome. Each disability has its own challenges, so knowing your stuff is crucial. They actually suggest in the guide that you should try to shadow people in different settings to see how it really works.
Oh, that's such good advice. You can only get so much from reading, right?
Totally. Hands-on is everything. And speaking of learning, they talk a lot about trauma-informed care, which, like, makes sense. A lot of these kids have been through some kind of trauma, right?
So it's not just dealing with the disability, it's understanding how that trauma impacts them, their behavior, everything.
Yeah, it's about seeing the whole child. And they even had a section on using those sensory rooms, you know, as part of trauma-informed care. They're really helpful, apparently. Like if a kid is feeling overwhelmed, those rooms can be really grounding for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Having a place that feels safe, predictable, where you can just, like, de-escalate.
It can make all the difference, especially when you're dealing with challenging behaviors, which, let's face it, are going to happen.
Oh, for sure. That's actually what I was going to ask you about next.
Yeah.
Even if you have all the training, you're using this trauma-informed approach, there's still going to be times, right? What does the guide say about handling that?
Well, one thing they emphasize is positive reinforcement, like really focus on catching those good behaviors and rewarding them. It sounds simple, but it's really effective.
Yeah, it's about changing the focus. Instead of always reacting to the negative, you're trying to, like, build at the positive.
Exactly. And when those challenging behaviors do happen, staying calm, responding consistently, it's key. Although I'm sure that's easier said than done sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine.
Like they give this example in the guide. Imagine a kid is having a total meltdown because they can't have this certain toy, right? Instead of getting caught up in that immediate outburst, you have to try to figure out what's really going on. Maybe the kid is overstimulated or they have trouble communicating, so this is their way of expressing that.
So you're kind of like deciphering, seeing the behavior as a form of communication, not just defiance.
Yeah. And the guide really stresses how important active listening is. Remembering that every child communicates in their own way. Sometimes, honestly, the best thing you can do is give them space.
Yeah, sometimes that's all any of us need, right?
Yeah,
Just a minute to chill out.
exactly. And that can be where those sensory rooms are super useful. Again, they provide this predictable environment that can help kids calm themselves down.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the challenges, which are real, but let's not forget the rewards because it sounds like there are a ton. What are some of the things they highlight in the guide?
Oh man, so many. There's this one story about a worker, I think they called her Maria, who was helping this little girl who had some serious physical disabilities. And this little girl had always wanted to ride a bike, but it seemed impossible. But Maria, she refused to give up on that. She worked so hard with her, used all this adaptive equipment, and never stopped encouraging her. And then one day it happened, the little girl rode a bike. Can you imagine?
Stop. That's amazing. It gives me chills just hearing about it. That's the kind of impact you dream of making.
Totally. It shows you that this isn't just a job, it's about so much more. You're creating this loving, supportive space where these kids feel safe, like they matter, and they can achieve anything.
It's like being part of a family in a way.
Hmm.
Speaking of family, the guide really pushes that, the idea that families need to be part of this whole thing.
Oh, 100%. Families are the experts on their own kids, right? So it's about working with them, not trying to take over. That might mean regular check-ins, family meetings, even home visits, just to keep that communication open and build trust.
Which I imagine takes a lot of sensitivity, especially since the families are probably dealing with a lot themselves emotionally.
You're so right. It's not always easy. They could be facing challenges, guilt, even denial. The guide really emphasizes how important it is to be empathetic, understanding that everyone's doing their best with what they've got. Sometimes just listening and being supportive is the most powerful thing you can do.
It's a good reminder for all of us, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about what it's like now, but what about the future? What does the RoleCatcher guide say about where all of this is headed? The future, right? That's the big question for any job, but especially one that's changing this fast. So what'd they say? Any big trends we should know about?
Well, tech is definitely going to be huge, even more than it is now.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And I don't just mean like using tablets or whatever, although that's part of it. They were talking about things like using virtual reality to help kids with autism with their social skills.
Yes.
Wild, right?
No way, really. That's amazing. It's like we're living in the future already.
Right. And that's just the beginning, it seems like. They also talked a lot about personalized care plans, like moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach, because every kid is different, obviously. They called it a strength-based approach.
I like that. Sounds empowering.
Yeah, exactly. It's about focusing on what they can do. And that's where specialization comes in again. With everything changing so fast, you really need to be an expert in something specific.
Which makes sense. So what are some of those areas that a residential childcare worker might specialize in?
One that's really in demand is behavioral intervention. So these are the people who really get to the bottom of why a child might be acting out, figuring out how to help them.
Oh, wow. So they're like detectives almost.
Kind of, yeah. They have to work really closely with therapists, teachers, everyone to come up with those individual plans. It's a lot of collaboration.
Sounds intense, but also incredibly rewarding if you can, like, make a real difference for the kid.
Absolutely. And then there's life skills development, which is huge too. Like, imagine working with a teenager with Down syndrome, teaching them how to cook or manage their money, how to use public transportation.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those are essential skills.
Totally. It's about giving them the tools they'll need to be independent as they get older.
I love that.
Yeah.
It really is about looking past the disability, seeing the person and what they can achieve.
You got it. And that ties into another area, community outreach and support. Because if we're going to have these more inclusive communities, residential childcare workers are going to be so important in that transition.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. So, like connecting families with resources, making sure these kids aren't isolated from their community.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong.
I love it.
Oh,
Okay, so we've talked about a lot today, from what it's like right now to what the future holds for residential childcare workers. One thing's for sure, it takes a special kind of person. But the impact you can have, that's huge. You said it yourself at the beginning, it's a calling. So for anyone listening who feels that call, but they're also maybe a little overwhelmed or even scared, what would you say to them?
oh, it's totally normal to feel that way. It's a big decision.
Hmm.
Honestly, I'd say just start learning as much as you can. Read that role catcher guide. Talk to people who are actually doing the work. Even volunteer if you can. Get a feel for it.
That's such good advice. And I would add, take care of yourself too.
Oh, yeah. That's crucial. You can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Right.
Make sure you have support, people you can talk to, ways to manage the stress. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
So true. Well, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, I hope this is giving you a lot to think about. No matter where you are in your journey, just remember, every child deserves to feel loved, valued, and empowered. And if that's something you're passionate about, becoming a residential childcare worker could be the most amazing adventure.